Picture this. A formal dinner. 40 of England's most watchful eyes. Crystal catching candlelight above a table set with silver that Annabeth Voss had polished herself that very morning on her knees in the cold. She was seated at the far end, below the salt, where servants sat when they sat at all. She had been doing the work of 3 maids since arriving at Hartmore Hall 6 weeks ago, and no one had thought to question why a woman with her hands had such steady eyes. At the head of the table, the Duke of Hartmore raised his glass. He was not looking at his intended. He was looking at the woman beside him. A guest, a widow from Bath, a woman named Mrs. Sable Price who wore rubies and smiled at everything the Duke said as though he were terribly clever. His Grace leaned toward her and said something meant only for her ear, and she laughed, and the table watched, and Annabeth Voss, seated at the far end with the junior footman, and set down her water-glass very carefully, and said nothing at all, because she knew something none of them did. Hartmore Hall belonged to her family. It had belonged to her father, and before him, his father, and before that, a line of Vossmen stretching back 200 years. She had grown up in the room where the Duke now slept. She had learned her letters in the library he had since converted to a billiards room. She had stood at her father's funeral in the churchyard at the edge of the property, 17 years old, and been told by the family solicitor that a contested clause in the inheritance had given everything, the house, the land, the income, to a distant male cousin she had never met. That cousin had sold it to the Duke within a year. Annabeth had spent the following decade understanding, in precise and methodical detail, exactly what had happened and what, if anything, might be done about it. It turned out that quite a lot might be done, but first she needed to be inside the house. So here she was, below the salt, polishing silver. She watched the Duke laugh at something Mrs. Price said and thought, not yet. She had learned patience the way you learn it when you have no other choice. Slowly, through gritted teeth, until it becomes something else, something colder and more useful. Not yet. But soon. Annabeth had not always been methodical. At 17, she had wept. At 18, she had written letters. At 19, she had hired a solicitor of her own, a Mr. Colquhoun, who was old and careful and had the particular quality of a man who reads documents the way other men read maps, looking not at the surface but at the edges, the margins, the small print that other people assume means nothing. He had found something in the margins. The clause that had transferred Hartmore Hall to the mail line was real, but the execution of it had not been clean. There was a question, not a certainty, but a question, which in Mr. Colquhoun's considered estimation was enough, about whether the transfer had been properly witnessed. And if the transfer was improperly witnessed, the subsequent sale to the Duke had been made on a foundation that did not, strictly speaking, hold. This was not information to bring to a court without evidence. And the evidence, Mr. Colquhoun had told her in his careful way, was in the house. Specifically, in the household records kept by the steward for the 3 years before her father's death. Those records, if they showed what he suspected they showed, would demonstrate that the witnesses had not been present on the date written. The household records were in the Hartmore Hall estate office, and so Annabeth Voss had written a letter of application for a domestic position, signed it with her mother's maiden name, and presented herself at the servants' entrance on a gray November morning with 2 trunks. Good references she had taken considerable care to arrange, and the expression of a woman who intended to be unremarkable. She had been unremarkable for 6 weeks. The work was not what she had imagined, which said something about the limits of imagination. She had known it would be hard. She had not fully understood what hard meant when applied to rising at 5 in the morning, carrying coal up 4 flights of stairs before the house woke, and eating supper standing up in a kitchen that smelled of grease and damp night wool. She understood now. She did not complain. There was no one to complain to, and she had come here for a reason. The estate office was kept locked. The housekeeper at Hartmore Hall was a woman named Mrs. Stanhope, who had been managing the house for 11 years and who had the look of someone who managed things in other areas of her life too, carefully, without light sentiment, with a precision that Annabeth found easier to respect than to like. Mrs. Stanhope did not waste words. She assessed things. She had assessed Annabeth on her first morning, asked her 3 questions, watched the answers without expression, and then said, "You'll do. Start with the east wing." It was Mrs. Stanhope who first noticed something was wrong with the Duke's arrangement with Mrs. Price. Not wrong in the moral sense. Mrs. Stanhope was not a woman who concerned herself with morality when discretion was a sufficient substitute. Wrong in the practical sense. Wrong in the sense of being handled badly, without the discretion a man of his position owed to his household. "He brings her to the table," Mrs. Stanhope said one evening in the kitchen, not to Annabeth specifically, not to anyone specifically, in the way of a woman thinking aloud. "That is his business. But he seats her above Lady Forthwick and expects me to pretend I don't see the look on Lady Forthwick's face." She picked up her pen and returned to her household accounts without elaborating. That was all she said. But Annabeth, sitting 3 chairs away, mending a curtain hem, filed it away. The house had opinions. Houses always did, in her experience. You had to learn to listen. The housekeeper's key ring hung on a hook inside the office off the kitchen. Annabeth had noted this on her second day. The estate office key was on that ring. She had thought about it every day since. She had not taken it. Patience. Not yet. But she had done other things. She had made herself useful in ways that were visible and ways that were not. She had quietly reorganized the linen cupboard on the 3rd floor, which had been in a state that Mrs. Stanhope found objectionable, and said nothing about having done it. Mrs. Stanhope had noticed. She said nothing either, but she began, after that, to assign Annabeth to tasks that required judgment rather than mere labor. That was how Annabeth ended up, 3 weeks after her arrival, carrying the week's menu cards to the estate office for filing. With Mrs. Stanhope's key, she filed the menu cards. Then she stood in the estate office for 4 minutes and looked at the filing cabinets along the west wall. She did not touch them. She was not ready. She did not yet know what she was looking for with enough precision to find it quickly, and she could not afford to be in that room long enough to be careless. She went back upstairs. That night, she wrote to Mr. Colquhoun and asked him to send her, in as much detail as he was able, exactly what she needed to find. The Duke of Hartmore was not a bad man. Annabeth had been prepared to find him contemptible. It would have been simpler, and had found instead that he was simply not paying attention. He was 34, inherited the title at 22, and had spent the intervening years doing what men of his position did when the world arranged itself around their comfort without requiring them to think much about it. He managed the estate through his steward. He visited London when it suited him. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman who had married someone else, and had evidently not quite recovered from this, though he would not have said so. He was polite to the servants in the absent way of a man who has been told to be polite to servants, and has internalized the instruction without the understanding behind it. He knew Mrs. Stanhope's name and no one else's. He did not know Annabeth's name. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, precisely, without sentiment. It was useful, in fact. Invisible people could go places. Mrs. Price was a different matter. Mrs. Price noticed things. She had the sharp, restless attention of a woman accustomed to assessing rooms for what they could offer her, and Annabeth had caught herself being assessed more than once, not with recognition, but with the particular wariness of a woman who instinctively identifies other women who are more than they appear. Annabeth made herself smaller when Mrs. Price looked at her. It was not difficult. She had become, over 6 weeks, quite good at small. The formal dinner in the second week of December was the first time Annabeth understood how badly this was going to go. Not for her, for the Duke. Mrs. Price, she had gathered from fragments of conversation overheard in the way that servants overhear everything, was a widow of 7 years whose finances were not what they appeared. A previous connection in Bristol had ended badly. A gentleman in Derbyshire had once been very taken with her and was no longer in possession of his estate. These were not rumors Annabeth had sought. They had come to her through the natural current of a house that talked, and she had accepted them the way she accepted everything now, quietly, and with the understanding that information was its own form of preparation. At that dinner, watching the Duke lean toward Mrs. Price with his glass raised and his attention narrowed to one woman in a room that held 40, Annabeth thought, "He has no idea." She thought this without satisfaction. She was not here for him, but she noted it. She set down her water glass and returned to being invisible. Mr. Colquhoun's letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked inside a parcel of items she had arranged to be sent from her rooms in London. The letter itself was 4 pages long, close-written, methodical. He told her precisely which year's records she needed, which months, which entries, the witnesses' names, the dates in question, what a discrepancy would look like versus what a clean record would look like. She read it twice in the cold of her bedroom at 5:30 in the morning, then burned it in the small fireplace and went to start the coal fires. She knew now what she was looking for. She needed 40 minutes in the estate office. She needed the key. The opportunity came 9 days later, in the particular way that opportunities come when you have been waiting for them long enough, not dramatically, but through a sequence of small, unrelated events that happened to align. Mrs. Stanhope was called away to attend a matter in the village. She left the key ring on its hook and told Annabeth to receive the linen delivery expected that afternoon. The delivery was late. The house was, for 2 hours, operating without its usual center. Annabeth went to the estate office. She had 40 minutes. She used 37. The records were there, and the discrepancy was there. The witnesses' signatures on the instrument were dated 3 days before the witnesses had, according to the household accounts, arrived at Hartmore Hall. They had signed something they could not have been present to sign. She did not take the records. Taking them would have alerted someone. Instead, she had brought, rolled into the lining of her apron, 3 sheets of paper and a pencil, and she copied what she needed with the focused speed of a woman who has been practicing handwriting by lamplight for 3 weeks in preparation for exactly this. Then she returned the keys to the hook, received the linen delivery, noted every item in the household ledger in her clearest hand, and went help with supper. That evening she wrote to Mr. Colquhoun. The letter was 2 sentences long. "I have found what we discussed. Proceed as you think best." She sat for a long time after sealing it, in the cold and quiet of her room, listening to the house settle around her. She had grown up in these walls. She knew the particular sound they made in December, the way the east wind found the gaps around the upper windows and made a low, sustained note that was somewhere between a groan and a hum. She had missed it without knowing she had missed it. That was the thing about losing something you took for granted. You didn't know it was gone until you stood in the middle of its absence and felt the shape of the space it had left. She was not sentimental. She was not going to become sentimental now. She put on her coat. She slept. She rose at 5. The Duke sent for her 3 days later. She had not expected this. She had been careful. She was certain of it, and she ran through the possibilities as she followed the footman up the main stairs, which she was not permitted to use, ordinarily, toward the study. Either she had made an error she had not identified, or something else had happened. The study was a room she had known as her father's sitting room. It had been repaneled in dark walnut, which had not been there before, and the desk was new, and the books on the shelves were different. But the window looked out onto the same copper beech that had stood in the east garden for as long as she could remember, and the light came through it in the same way, low and pale in December, laying itself across the floor in long strips. She kept her face very still. The Duke was standing by the window. He turned when she entered, and she saw that he was holding a letter. Mr. Colquhoun's first letter to the Duke's solicitor had evidently arrived. "Sit down," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had been startled and was working to recover. "I understand, that is to say, I have been made to understand, that you are not who you have represented yourself to be." "I have not misrepresented myself," Annabeth said, and heard her own voice come out clearer than she intended. "I gave my mother's name. I have done the work asked of me. I have not stolen anything or deceived anyone about my capacities." He looked at her for a long moment. He had, she noticed, the slightly dazed expression of a man who had been expecting a different kind of conversation and was finding the reality considerably less tractable. "You are Annabeth Voss," he said. "I am. This house was my father's house," she said. "Yes." The silence that followed had several qualities. It was not comfortable. It was not hostile either, quite. It was the silence of a man confronting something he had accepted without examination and was now being asked to examine, and finding the examination inconvenient. "Why," he said at last, "did you not simply write to me or to my solicitors? If there was a question about the title—" "I wrote to your solicitors 4 years ago," Annabeth said. "I was told the matter was settled. 2 years ago I wrote again. The letter was not acknowledged. The documents I needed were in this house. There was no other way to reach them." He set down the letter. He looked at the window. He looked at the copper beech, which was bare now, its branches making their particular pattern against the pale December sky. "You polished my silver," he said, which was not, she thought, the most pertinent observation available to him, but was perhaps the one that had struck him most personally. "I did," she said, "very thoroughly." Something moved across his face. She had no precise name for it. It was complicated, whatever it was. She did not leave Hartmore Hall. This was the thing that surprised her afterward, that she had expected to leave, had been prepared to leave, had, in some part of herself, been ready to take the copies she had made to had Mr. Colquhoun and conduct the rest from a safe distance. That would have been the sensible approach. But the Duke did not ask her to leave. He asked her to remain while the matter was reviewed. He said this in the tone of a man who was making an offer rather than issuing a command, which Annabeth noted. She remained. She continued her work. The situation was, to say the least, unusual. What changed was that she was no longer invisible. The Duke knew who she was now, and knowing a thing makes it difficult to unsee, and so he began to see her. Not as the woman he had thought she was, but not quite as himself either. He would encounter her in the corridor outside the library, and pause in a way he had not paused before. He would begin a sentence, and then seem to reconsider it. He asked her, once, whether the billiards room had always been a billiards room, and she told him no, it had been her father's library, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said he had wondered, because the proportions seemed wrong for it. She had thought the same thing since she arrived. The proportions were wrong for it. Her father's library had needed ceiling height shelves, and a reading chair by the east window, and the particular dusty afternoon smell that books accumulate over decades. And none of those things were there. She told him this without quite intending to. He listened without quite intending to listen. She suspected, and then said nothing, and they stood in the doorway of the wrong room for a moment before he excused himself, and she went back to her work. This was not, she told herself, relevant. Mrs. Price was still in the house. That was relevant. Mrs. Price was still smiling at everything the Duke said, and still examining Annabeth with that watchful, calculating attention, and still speaking of her position in the Duke's life in terms that implied considerably more than a guest. The other women of the household had opinions about this that they did not, strictly speaking, share in Annabeth's hearing, but that she nonetheless heard. The cook, a forthright woman named Mrs. Dawlish, had been at Hartmore Hall for 23 years, had known Annabeth's father, and had greeted the news of Annabeth's identity with the particular combination of unsurprise and vindicated concern that belongs to people who have suspected something wrong for a long time without being able to name it. The house has been different since he bought it, Mrs. Dawlish said once, in the kitchen, not to Annabeth, not to anyone, in the same way Mrs. Stanhope had spoken. Not bad, just off. Annabeth kept her face very still and said nothing, but she thought, yes, the Christmas dinner was the occasion Mrs. Price had chosen, apparently, to clarify her intentions. It was done not with a declaration, nothing so legible as that, but with a precision of positioning that left little room for misinterpretation. She arrived in the drawing-room before dinner wearing the Hartmore rubies. Not her own rubies. The Hartmore rubies, which were the house's rubies, which had been on display in the cabinet in the upper gallery since the Duke had opened the house, and which were not, as far as anyone had been informed, available to guests. Mrs. Stanhope's expression, when Mrs. Price entered the drawing-room, was the expression of a woman who has many things to say and the professional discipline not to say any of them. The Duke looked at Mrs. Price. "Meet these." He looked at the rubies. He said nothing. He was, Annabeth had come to understand, not a man who said things readily when he was uncertain how he felt about them. Annabeth was setting the table in the adjoining dining room. She could see them through the open doorway. She watched the Duke not say anything about the rubies, and watched Mrs. Price take this as permission, and watched the room. 12 dinner guests, all of them connected, all of them watching, absorbed the implication. She finished setting the last place and returned to the kitchen. Mrs. Dawlish was checking the roasting pan. Neither of them spoke. Later, after the dinner, after the guests had moved to the drawing-room and the servants were clearing the table, Annabeth heard the Duke's voice from the hall, speaking quietly and with a restraint that told her, because she was learning to read him, that he was not feeling restrained. She did not hear what he said. She heard Mrs. Price's answer, which was light, amused, entirely confident, the voice of a woman who had played this particular game before and knew how to read the board. She heard the Duke say, "The rubies are not mine to lend." A pause, then he said, "And I am not ready to change that." She did not know whether he meant he was not ready to marry, or not ready to marry her, or something else entirely. She was not sure it mattered, not to her purpose. She went back to clearing the table, but she remembered it. January brought Mr. Colquhoun to Hartmore Hall in person. He arrived with a case of documents that he spread across the dining table in the absence of guests. And he explained to the Duke, in the methodical and precise way he explained everything, the nature of the discrepancy in the original transfer, what it meant for the title, and what the legal remedies available to both parties were. He was not combative. He was not sentimental. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading situations the way other men read maps, and he presented the terrain without telling anyone where to walk. The Duke listened with the attention of a man who had been, in recent weeks, practicing listening. When Mr. Colquhoun finished, the Duke was quiet for a long time. Then he asked what Annabeth wanted. Annabeth, seated across the table, had prepared for many versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for the question to be that direct or that early. "The house," she said. He looked at her. "The house and the income from the estate," she continued, "as it stood at my father's death. I am not asking for the value of your improvements. I am not asking for anything acquired after the transfer. I am asking for what was taken. That would leave me, he said, considerably diminished. Yes, she said. I know. He was quiet again. Mrs. Price had left 2 days before, had been asked to leave quietly by a conversation Annabeth had not witnessed but had understood from the way the house felt the following morning, lighter in some specific way, as though it had been holding its breath. You could have brought this claim years ago, the Duke said. Why wait? I didn't have the evidence years ago, she said. It was here. You came here to find it. Another silence. The documents lay between them, pages covered in Mr. Colquhoun's careful handwriting. Outside, the east garden was frozen, the copper beech bare and patient. The billiards room, the Duke said abruptly. She looked at him. I should like to restore it, he said. If that is, I should like to know what it was, what it ought to be, whether the books can be traced, what the chair looked like. I find I have been in a room that was proportioned wrong without understanding why, and I should like to understand why. She looked at him for a long moment. He was, she thought, not at all who she had expected to find when she arrived here with her 2 trunks and her mother's name and 6 weeks of patience, stored like firewood for the winter. My father's books were sold in the estate sale, she said. Some of them at least. Mrs. Dawlish might know where. She seems to know where everything went. Mrs. Dawlish, he said, with the expression of a man suddenly aware that he does not know as many names in his own house as he ought. The cook. She has been here 23 years, Annabeth said. She knew my father. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the particular look of a man who has been told something that reconfigures other things he thought he understood. Miss Voss, he said, I should like, that is, I am aware that the situation is not one that can be resolved simply or quickly, but I should like to handle it honestly, without legal proceedings if that is possible. I should like to do what is right. She looked at him for a long moment. In 10 years of working toward this, she had imagined many versions of this conversation. In some of them she had won decisively and felt the clean satisfaction of it. In some she had won and felt nothing at all. In some she had stood in the estate office with 40 minutes and a pencil and known, finally, that she had what she needed, and the feeling had not been triumph. It had been something quieter, the click of a thing settling into its correct position. She had not imagined this version. Then, let us be honest, she said. The restoration of the library took 3 months. It was, in the end, a collaboration which was not something Annabeth had anticipated, and which she found, in practice, considerably less uncomfortable than she had assumed it would be. The Duke had a good eye for proportion. The wrong proportions of the billiards room had always bothered him, he admitted, without his understanding why. And Annabeth knew exactly what the room had been, which meant she knew exactly what it needed to become again. Mrs. Dawlish knew where 4 boxes of her father's books had gone. A vicar in the village had purchased them at the estate sale and kept them in his vestry, because he could not bear to see them dispersed. He was an elderly man who had, it turned out, been friends with her father and who wept when Annabeth came to collect them, and who said that he had never quite believed the transfer of the estate had been proper, and had said so at the time to anyone who would listen. No one listened much, he said. No, she said. I know. She brought the books back in a cart, which the Duke had arranged without being asked. He helped carry them in, which he did not need to do, which seemed to be a deliberate choice. Mrs. Stanhope watched this from the upper landing with the expression of someone revising several previous assumptions. The reading chair was found in the attic under a dust sheet. It had been her father's chair, unmistakably. She would have known the shape of it in her sleep. And finding it there, preserved and covered, as though someone had known it might be wanted again, was the closest she came to crying in the entire 3 months. She did not cry. She had the chair brought down and placed by the east window, where the light came through in the afternoon, in exactly the way she remembered. The legal question was resolved in April, in the particular way that legal questions resolve when both parties have decided to treat them as questions of right rather than strategy. The transfer was declared invalid. The subsequent sale was unwound. The house and the estate income reverted to Annabeth Voss in her own name, as it should have been from the beginning. The Duke remained at Hartmore Hall. This was, she would freely admit, not the conclusion she had envisioned. She had imagined him packing for London. She had imagined the house returning to her empty of everyone except Mrs. Stanhope, Mrs. Dawlish, the footman, and the 2 housemaids who had been here since before his arrival. She had imagined beginning again, alone, which she was good at, which she had become very good at over 10 years. What happened instead was that he asked, in the careful way he had developed of asking things he was uncertain about, whether she would consider allowing him to remain while he arranged a suitable property elsewhere. He had invested considerably in the estate, he said, in the drainage on the north fields and the new roof on the west wing, which was true, she had to acknowledge, and he would need time to arrange his affairs. He was not asking for the house, he was asking for time. 6 months, perhaps. She told him 6 months was acceptable. That had been 8 months ago. She was not going to mention this to him. She was fairly certain he knew. The library was finished now. Complete, which was not quite the same as restored. It was both more and less than what had been there. Her father's books on the south shelves, the new books the Duke had added on the north, which turned out to be considerably better chosen than she had expected. The reading chair by the east window. A second chair, which had appeared one afternoon without explanation or announcement, placed at what she had to admit was exactly the right angle to the fire. He was in that chair now. He was reading an agricultural report, which he had taken to reading with the attention of a man who had recently discovered that land management, done properly, was considerably more interesting than he had previously assumed. He had joined the County Drainage Committee in October. She had heard about this from the steward before she heard it from him, which seemed characteristic. She was at the desk, reviewing Mr. Colhound's latest letter regarding the Northfield tenants whose leases needed updating. Outside, the early April light was doing its particular thing to the copper beech, which had come back into leaf in the past week, brilliant and new. "The Haverstock lease," she said. He said, without looking up. He had learned, she had noticed, that she was not asking a question when she spoke names like that. She was thinking aloud. "The terms haven't been revised in 9 years. The tenants have improved the drainage themselves at their own expense. The current rate doesn't reflect the improvements. You should revise it in their favor," he said. "I intend to." She looked at him. "I wanted to know if you had thoughts." He put down the agricultural report. He looked at her across the library that had once been wrong and was now, for the first time, right. He had the expression he sometimes had when she asked his opinion, the expression of a man slightly surprised, still, that the question was genuine. "I think," he said, "that fair dealing is practical as well as correct. Tenants who feel their improvements are recognized work better ground." "Yes," she said, "that's what I thought." A pause, the fire, the light on the copper beech. "Miss Voss," he said, "Annabeth." He stopped. She waited. He was not, as she had occasion to observe over 8 months, a man who rushed. He said things when he was ready to say them, and he was ready now. "I have been in this house," he said, "for 6 years. I did not know its name for it, and I have been, I want to say, honest. I have been trying to be honest since the December dinner, since Mr. Colhound. I have been trying to look at things properly instead of assuming they are what they appear." She said nothing. She was looking at him across the desk. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the 3rd week of your polishing my silver. I am aware this is not the most dignified admission. I have been trying to find a moment that was appropriate and have concluded that there may not be one, and that waiting for one is simply another form of not paying attention, which I have been told I am very good at and intend to improve. The afternoon light lay across the library floor in long strips. The agricultural report sat closed on the arm of the second chair. Outside, the copper beech moved in the spring wind. Annabeth Voss set down Mr. Colhound's letter. She had been prepared, in the course of 10 years, for a great many things. She had been prepared for disappointment and litigation and letters that went unanswered and 6 weeks below the salt. She had not, if she was going to be honest about it, prepared for this. I am not, she said carefully, an easy person to be in love with. No, he agreed, I have noticed. I find I am not deterred. I spent 6 weeks in your house, pretending to be someone else. You were not pretending to be someone else. You were protecting your interests by available means. There is a difference. He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was simply his nature. I have been going over the December dinner with some regularity. You watched me sit there with the Rubies and the wrong woman, and you said nothing, because it was not your concern. But you watched. She said nothing. She had watched. That is the kind of person you are, he said. You see things clearly and you act on what you see, and you do not act before you are ready, and you are ready for very little before you have understood it completely. I find this. He paused. I find it completely extraordinary. The fire crackled. Annabeth looked at the desk, at the letter from Mr. Colquhoun, at the afternoon light on the floorboards. She thought about her father's library, found wrong and made right again. She thought about the chair by the east window. She thought about the second chair, placed without announcement at exactly the correct angle, which she had not questioned and which he had never explained. Ask me properly, she said. Something moved in his face, the precondition of a smile, which was the expression she had learned to recognize before the real thing arrived. Miss Voss, he said. Annabeth, I am asking if you might consider allowing me to remain, not on the basis of drainage investments, or a 6-month arrangement that we have both allowed to become 8, but because I find, given the opportunity, I would rather be here than anywhere else I have been. I am asking, with full knowledge of what the question means, whether you would be willing to let me stay. She looked at him across the library for a long moment. The 6 months are negotiable, she said. He smiled, the full one. She had suspected it was there. I should mention, he said, that I have written to Mrs. Dawlish about the chair. Which chair? The second chair. I asked her whether it was in the right place. She said the right place for a second chair in that room was exactly where I had put it, which she seemed to feel was self-evident, and I should have asked sooner. She has been here 23 years, Annabeth said. Yes, he said. I know all their names now outside. The copper beech was very bright in the April light. The books stood on the south shelves where they belonged. The chair was by the east window. The letter from Mr. Colquhoun waited on the desk, the Haverstock lease to be revised in the tenant's favor, the north field accounted for, the house in its correct hands, the room at last proportioned right. Annabeth picked up her pen. She had work to do, and the afternoon was clear, and the apple trees along the east garden wall. Her father had planted them. She had found, the spring before he died, were showing the first faint swelling at their tips that meant, if you knew to look for it, that something was coming. She knew to look for it. She wrote the first line of the lease revision, and the fire crackled, and the house, which had been her father's, and then someone else's, and was now completely and irrevocably hers again, settled quietly around her like something that had been waiting a very long time to do exactly that.